Oppenheimer's a slightly different situation because the director there, Chris Nolan, said there was no CGI and there possibly isn't any CGI produced elements in that film, but there's a lot of digital compositing. And so what happened there is that people took his comment about CGI and just assumed he meant, no, we didn't use any visual effects. Well, they used a lot of visual effects.
Hi, and welcome to StudioBinder Academy. I'm Brandon. Today we're speaking with Ian Fales, author of Masters of FX and editor-in-chief of the website Befores and Afters. Ian, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
Now, to get started, we like to get everyone's backstory. Could you tell us how you became a writer and where your interest in video effects came from?
Well, the thing people should know about me is I'm not a trained writer or journalist. I kind of am a bit of a blogger turned journalist. But my initial work background is that I did law at university and then went on to study, to practice law for about 10 years. But while I was studying, I was obsessed with filmmaking and visual effects. Just as an audience member, really, watching big films, Star Wars, of course, Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, The Abyss, those sorts of films. And then at university, I discovered this magazine I didn't even know existed, a print magazine called Cinefex, which sadly is no longer around, but was basically the Bible for visual effects for 40 years. And so it wasn't really available in Australia except at comic book stores. So I just used to gather it up as much as I could from everywhere. And then eBay came around and I ordered every single back issue I could find on eBay. Spent a lot of money on that. But, I just absorbed it because a big film would come out and then there was this, huge article about how they did the visual effects. And the internet was around, but there weren't really any in-depth places you could find out that information. At the same time, a VFX artist called Todd Vasari had started a website called VFX HQ. Todd's still around. He's an amazing compositing supervisor at ILM and has a huge following on Twitter, actually, related to visual effects. So those were the two big influences. I was working as a lawyer and then also started my own blog called VFX Blog in the early 2000s when, that was popular to do. And that just became a way for me to write about visual effects. And I started doing a couple of interviews myself. And then a publication in Sydney called FX Guide said, hey, stop competing with us. Why don't you come and write for us? And so I went to FX Guide. Big deal to leave my job as a lawyer. It was pretty comfortable, but I was clearly more obsessed with filmmaking, visual effects, and writing as well. And I left FX Guide after 5 years, did some freelance writing, and then thought I really want to start my own publication. And that became Befores and Afters, which is now web articles, podcast, a print magazine itself. And it's 5 years old, just very recently. So absolutely loving it.
Well, excellent. And congratulations. Yeah,
Thank you.
That is a big move, to leave a job as a lawyer to go write about video effects, but it looks like it's working out for you.
It was. Yeah, don't bring it up with my parents. That's all I say.
I am mum. Now, if we could, I would like to get into some of the definitions. Now, there are different terms that go into video effects, visual effects, special effects, mechanical effects. Could you define visual effects and how it's most commonly used?
Yeah, it's a really good question because what the challenge is that the two main terms, visual effects and special effects, are absolutely used interchangeably. They're you'll hear an interview with a director, a filmmaker, an actor, or even just conversations between your friends when they say, oh, I love the special effects. And what they really mean is they love the visual effects or vice versa. And then we'll get to talking about this, I'm sure, Brennan, but CGI has sort of become a term that seems to cover all that as well. But strictly speaking, visual effects you need to think about in a film or a TV show or a commercial is really, it's the imagery you see in a shot or sequence that you create where you couldn't go out and just shoot that with a normal film camera, cinema camera, normal camera at all. And so you have to do something special, hence why it was kind of called special effects, to make that happen. And I'm talking about, in terms of visual effects, adding a creature to a shot or putting an actor inside a big environment. And what that means is visual effects tends to get done after filming has been done, which is why it's often also called post-production or part of post-production. That doesn't mean all of it happens in post-production. These days, there's so many steps that happen during filming, before filming, after filming to enable visual effects. But that's sort of a very general view about what visual effects is. It's things you really couldn't just shoot live or just with a normal camera.
Okay, excellent. And how about special effects? What are some of those common uses?
Yeah, so special effects, the nuance and the difference there is that special effects really relates to things that you still can't really just go out and shoot easily, but that require some sort of practical effects, but often done on set. Things like explosions done on set, or gags, or water effects, rain, wind, mechanical effects, putting a partial helicopter on a gimbal and moving it around on a motion base with the actors inside. That's actually, that the gimbal setup and the mechanical effects side of that is special effects. If you then had to composite the actors in the helicopter into a sky environment or an alien environment, the whole process is called visual effects. It's very obvious why these two terms sort of get mixed up and used interchangeably. But the real distinction is that you could think of special effects as practical things attempted on set, during filming. Sometimes special effects has also kind of morphed into being also regarded as makeup effects or animatronics and creature work, say puppeteering a creature on set. That I think that is special effects, but it's sort of almost in the realm of just talking about makeup and creature effects work. And the other term I mentioned there was mechanical effects, which is definitely in the realm of special effects. Even things like car stunts and, making a car blow up or roll over on set is often the domain of the special effects supervisor on a big film. So hopefully that sort of like shows the two different kinds of effects that we're talking about, visual and special.
Definitely. Yeah, it sounds like, visual effects is done more digitally on a computer or something along those lines, whereas the special effects is more practical on set, the physical doing of something. Is that kind of correct?
Well, these days, absolutely. I mean, we really do recognize visual effects as being a digital thing where a creature might be animated using computer animation by an artist and digitally composited into a scene. But historically, I mean, essentially every film you watch is a visual effect, because it's a trick of the motion of images in your eyes. And that means for however long film has existed, there have been visual effects done, which of course were not digital at the beginning. Anytime you saw a miniature used or, some sort of trick photography or a matte painting, in really up until the 80s and then early 90s, everything was done optically in an analog way. And basically it was still called visual effects, but it was just pre-digital, done before we use these digital tools that we're so used to using today.
Excellent. And now you did mention this, CGI. how would you define CGI and how is it commonly used?
Yeah. So CGI, computer generated imagery, is of course the biggest thing that we do in the visual effects industry these days. And the reason is, with computer generated imagery, you can create anything or recreate anything just about. It's used in so many ways, creating spaceships, vehicles, digital humans, explosions, simulating fire, water, snow. I mean, there's almost no end to what you can do with CGI. It's not that long ago, really, that convincing CGI was able to be used in feature films, at least. And everyone, of course, there was this magic period of really late 80s, early 90s when people realized the impact that CGI would have on movie making. But it was used earlier than that in, even some of the early Star Wars films. And one of the pioneering companies there was Industrial Light and Magic, doing CGI before, many other studios, as well as a lot of the analog work. But yeah, CGI really means anything that you generate using a computer, and then you have to add that to a scene that you might have shot. Or there's, of course, in many shows, films, commercials, fully CGI scenes where the whole thing is generated inside the computer.
Now, there seems to be a lot of conflation between these terms. Do you think it's important to kind of solidify these definitions of these categories?
Yes, it's a really good question again, where what's happening in recent times is that people will say, and when I say people, I mean filmmakers, actors, studios, your friend next door will say CGI when they're talking about some sort of scene or sequence or character in a film or show, when they really mean the catch-all term of visual effects or digital visual effects. Because I guess we've seen so many films and shows with heavy CGI in recent times, pretty much superhero films of the last 10 to 15 years. And so the challenge is people regularly say CGI when they either don't know how a scene got done or they are trying to use it as a catch-all thing. What it creates is this slightly crazy confusion of saying that a particular sequence is CGI when in fact it might not be at all. It might be a sequence where they've shot two separate photographic elements and brought it together with, say, digital compositing. Literally, it might be an actor on a green screen and a car that they need to put that actor in. I mean, strictly speaking, that's just digital visual effects work, and it's not CGI. The nuance there is a bit hard to get your head around at first, but the reason that there's been this kind of oddness about people using that term CGI is when people use it and they use it in the bad connotation, right? This is I guess what we'll also talk about a little bit, Brennan, is
definitely.
Yeah, they're often not praising the CGI. They're often saying, "Oh, this scene, this sequence, this character looks too CGI," and I think that my fear is that what's happened is they've just sort of using CGI again as that catch-all term,
right?
And I think the problem is it's not correct, and so I'm sort of on a secret mission to try and change that. Especially when people say something like something feels overly CGI, and they have an affinity or that they really want things to go back to being practical. And that's part of this discussion as well, is people's obsession. And I don't just mean the audience members, but also directors, filmmakers, actors, an obsession for basically trying to shoot things for real and for it to be practical. Whereas the reality is most films these days use both kinds of methods. A filmmaker or a director will absolutely try and capture something for real or practical in a scene. It helps with immersing the actors in there. It seems to have some sort of tangibility, some tactileness. But there are also many, many examples where CGI and digital visual effects have been used, and quite frankly, the audience and even some actors and directors don't realize that there's been this intervention from digital visual effects at all. So that's a sort of long way of saying that the term CGI has created a few problems in discussing visual effects and animation, because as you know, there's this sort of negative connotation about CGI, whereas, I mean, gosh, look at something like Davy Jones from the Pirates of the Caribbean films.
Yes.
Completely CG created character by ILM and played on set by the amazing Bill Nighy, but that's completely CG. Nothing about Bill was kept in that plate in the final shot, and I think even another example is Baby Yoda or Grogu from the Mandalorian series. There are times when it's a puppet in the final shot, puppeteered by Legacy Effects. There are times when it's a completely digital Grogu done by ILM in the final shot. And I guarantee you people, if they were asked to do like the Pepsi challenge, they wouldn't actually know which one's which. And so, again, sorry to go on about this, but I think it's an interesting dynamic that's happened with CGI, which is not only is about the overly CGI thing, it's also about the practical versus digital debate. All those things are kind of wrapped into each other right now in the discourse about visual effects.
I agree. And do you think that these effects-heavy movies, superhero movies, do you think we're just getting fatigued of that, or are they causing us to be fatigued because we're just constantly being berated with all these effects everywhere?
Yeah, that's another good question. I think you're right. I mean, or that is a reason that we're have a bit of or the CGI stuff has a bad connotation. It's not so much CGI, it's a superhero fatigue. These films, these shows have massive sequences. I mean, sometimes they're difficult to follow, and they just feel, because they're on alien worlds or they're knocking down all these buildings, or these creatures and digital humans are doing things that aren't natural and don't seem real, that we're not believing it. Even if it looks photoreal, we're just not believing that could actually happen. And as you mentioned, there's so many of these projects that a famous visual effects supervisor actually said something like, special effects don't feel special anymore. And I think what he meant by that is that, it's hard to come up with something original. So a couple of things I see all the time in some of these shows is like characters, especially gory, huge monster characters, they all roar in a very certain way with saliva coming out of their mouths. I mean, the first time we ever saw that, it was probably like, oh my gosh, that's so real. But after the 100th time. And another one is like there's often a helicopter for a city shot will slide into frame and zoom ahead, because it looks cool. This is why these shots make it. But my takeaway from that is that you're not really experiencing necessarily bad CGI or bad visual effects. You're just a bit bored of the actual shot design. And that's another point, Brennan, to make here. Shot design is really what we're talking about when we're discussing films or shots. We're saying, do we think that shot looks cool? And the unfortunate bit is that people turn that into, oh, the CGI is bad, or it's overly CGI, when I really think what they mean is that the shot design is not original or doesn't work, or and then there are other things we could talk about later about how the actual setup of the shot didn't help when the visual effects artists come to it and do it. But your original question is, are we a bit fatigued by it? I think we kind of are. Which is why going to see amazing original films like Oppenheimer and Barbie and, films by Denis Villeneuve and others, just they do seem to have a nice original approach to this work. And I think we're ready for a refresh of the kind of shots and sequences that we've been seeing.
Now, as you and some others have pointed out, it seems like the studios and their marketing behind these types of films is kind of lending itself into that negative connotation. What do you make of that?
Well, yeah, it's a bit of an extension of what I was just saying in terms of the practical versus digital discourse. And sometimes that comes from audience members, wanting to harken back to a 1970s, 80s style of practical creature filmmaking or practical effects. Sure. I mean, we all love that. If we've grown up at that time, we sort of have this fond memory of it. And as you say, there's that fatigue side. But studios, I think, at some point, especially their marketing teams, and it sort of filters through to directors and actors discussing a film, that they really have this very strong push, I think, for saying everything is shot for real or shot practically. It's emerged for the reasons that we've just talked about, maybe some fatigue, maybe some criticism of the CGI over the years. But the craziest thing about it is it's often a lie. It's often a line in a production note from an official production note from a studio. It's often a throwaway line in a featurette that a studio produces, that we shot it all for real, that this was done with no CGI. I mean, some very egregious situations occurred in the last couple of years, talking when the film, say, Top Gun Maverick was being promoted. Incredible way that they shot that, with training some of the actors to be up in real jets and filming them with multiple cameras and getting great reaction shots and environments that way. But it was when some of the discourse came out about that, about how it was all shot in real jets, no CGI. I mean, it was just false. I mean, the film was nominated for a visual effects Oscar and had amazing digital visual effects done by a couple of studios. It came up again with films like Barbie and Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer's a slightly different situation because the director there, Chris Nolan, said there was no CGI and there possibly isn't any CGI produced elements in that film, but there's a lot of digital compositing. And so what happened there is that people took his comment about CGI, which was from like a magazine article and other places that he talked about it, and just assumed he meant, no, we didn't use any visual effects. Well, they used a lot of visual effects. They used a lot of photographic elements and plenty of special effects too. But he came across, unfortunately, as dissing CGI. I don't think that was actually Nolan's intention, but that certainly happened. Barbie was another example where the film had incredible production design and concept work and even miniatures that were built for reference for the film, but ended up having a lot of visual effects work as intended. It's a fake place, Barbie Land, and it's a film that suited having a lot of visual effects work. But there was a lot of discussion by various filmmakers part of the film and, a holding back from the overall studio for visual effects coverage. And that's a shame because there were hundreds of artists that were involved with that film. There's countless other examples. And the real challenge is, I think, studios in their marketing have somehow decided over the years that it's almost a failure if the film had to use lots of digital visual effects. And so they don't want to overly talk about it. I can kind of understand it a little bit because occasionally there might be a film review or discussion on social media about how a film is great, but, some of the CGI or the visual effects shots don't work. And that's what a studio wants to avoid. But I think, they have the power to actually prevent discussion about this sort of stuff by not letting people like me write articles about these films. And generally, people know in the industry when some visual effects has been done. And I've had great access over the years covering these films, but it's definitely being more tightly controlled. And that's a real challenge. I will say one other quick thing about that is I've kind of come around to feeling like I understand one point of view of the marketing efforts behind these films, and also what filmmakers want to do as well, is they want to release a film and they don't necessarily want the discourse to be about how a film was made, including the visual effects work. And so, we often hear the term from them is they don't want to let people peer behind the curtain. The challenge is, I think, is that that's fine. And in fact, is an example of that happening right now is June 2, Part 2. There's really not much visual effects coverage of that at the moment. But I think there will be come awards season, because I'm sure they would love a visual effects Oscar for that work. And I actually think that's fine. That's great. But the worst bit is that if during any promotion for the film, as has happened with some of the films that even get visual effects Oscar nominations, they essentially deny or say things that seem to convey that there's no CGI or visual effects in a film. And I mean, as I say, they're kind of lies. And it boggles the mind that happens, but it does. So
it's very interesting. It's very interesting because it's almost discrediting someone that did a really great job. You're doing everything to immerse the viewer into this world, and I feel like special effects, visual effects, CGI lends itself to that.
I think people who've been around, especially visual effects artists, they get it, and they like being invisible magicians. I think it's actually almost, if you, as I mentioned, the Grogu stuff before for Mandalorian, if you didn't know how that stuff was done, great, they've actually done their job. The worst bit is when, they're not acknowledged at all, and then that's actually tied in with some other problems with the visual effects industry in general, in terms of recognition and their place in the stratosphere of filmmakers. But it's kind of changing. There was with the strikes last year and with a lot of discussion about Barbenheimer and the role of visual effects there. I think there is more discussion about it, and it's been quite good in the last couple of months getting that word out. There's some really great players doing that. People like Jonas has a great he's in Denmark, has a great series about no CGI, and I've mentioned Todd Vasari before and Hugo Guerra. And look, I try and bring it up every moment I can.
Yes. We definitely want to shed light on it because it's something we see, but like you said, they're the invisible magicians. I like that term.
Exactly.
Nowadays, CGI, there's a lot going on with, the video effects artists themselves. It seems to be the idea that there's, maybe too many artists, not enough jobs, or vice versa, that there's not enough jobs and too many artists. But this is kind of leading the discussion of possibly unionizing video effects artists. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, so unionization. If you take North American filmmaking, Hollywood in particular, there's a very strong union side of that filmmaking in terms of the actors, producers, writers, directors even, and many of the below the line crew. And that's just historical. That's existed for a long time. at some point, visual effects has not really been a heavily unionized side of the industry. There's definitely pockets of it in North America and in some other places. But what unionization brings is obviously strength in numbers and negotiating powers and, powers to negotiate on wages and salaries and conditions. I mean, it doesn't work like that in visual effects at all. So they generally, because they're not a unionized side of the filmmaking business, they don't have the same agreements with the big filmmaking studios that other areas of filmmaking have. It's almost an impossible thing to do, perhaps, in visual effects as well, because it's global. It's not just North America. There's visual effects done in Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Australia, Britain, Europe. So it would be very tricky to only have the North American visual effects industry unionized or Canadian industry and not elsewhere, because presumably if you didn't want to deal with the unionized visual effects studio or artist, you could just go elsewhere. It's definitely a thing that people in the visual effects industry have been trying to do for a long time. And there was a couple of big moments in the past 10 to 20 years that sparked it. One was when Life of Pi won the visual effects Oscar, but then the main visual effects studio behind it, Rhythm and Hughes, went bankrupt. And, because they had just expended, well, they didn't survive. And, we all thought that there was a really good reason to unionize then. The strikes last year that have affected production in general, but also have affected visual effects, has seen another wave of, we should be unionized. And by the way, there are times in history where visual effects shops have been unionized. And there are times right now where some are embarking on that unionization. It's a very tricky thing because you have to organize, you have to get everyone to agree, you have to also go, what's the point of this? Is this about some sort of standard agreement with visual effects? As I understand it, it's a little bit more Wild West at the moment, very much individually negotiated on each project for each film and TV show, and of course it's across countries. The other thing is part of this unionization debate comes because of the globalization of the industry, as I've already mentioned. But in different areas, you have rebates and tax incentives and things like that. So visual effects shops have often opened up in multiple areas to take advantage of that because it helps studios and their bottom line. But unionization kind of conflicts with that because everyone's kind of out for themselves. It's a very complicated thing, very hard to solve. I want someone to solve it. But it's a really tricky thing. I think artists would love to be unionized. It's just a very freelance-based industry or contract-based industry at the moment. It doesn't quite have the same. Say we're talking about the unionization of directors and actors. I mean, there's a lot of them, but not that many. There's tens of thousands of visual effects artists around the world, and that's what makes it a bit more of a challenge to unionize, basically.
There seems to be an assumption that there's too many projects and not enough artists, which leads to a lesser quality output, which furthers that negative connotation. Do you agree with that, or do you see it differently?
Well, right now, it's completely the opposite. There's less production being made, and many visual effects artists, unfortunately, unemployed. Now, that's the result of several things. I guess the strikes basically halted a lot of production, and it's taken a while to get back on board. The other thing is, you can see from comments from Disney and other big makers of content that they're probably pulling back a little bit on these big movies, these big shows. I mean, gosh, bring up Netflix, and there's heaps of stuff, right? There's heaps of content out there. And visual effects artists have probably never been busier. But in general, there's a bit of a slowdown in the industry. So there's not too many projects and too few artists. Historically, there have been that problem. You know, coming out of COVID, production did ramp up, and the visual effects studios had kind of downsized, and there was this crazy wave of hiring. And you could argue that, you know, everyone was busy, so the best teams were already on the best shows, and maybe the more junior teams had to be put on other shows, and you could probably see some of the effects of that. Although I don't actually think that's the reason that any of these shows have poor quality visual effects, if people are saying that. There's so many reasons why a show can not have the world's best visual effects. It's budget, time, the production people, how these shots were imagined, how they were shot on the day. You know, there's just a bevy of reasons about why something doesn't work out. I mean, it's incredible that films get released at all, in my opinion, sometimes.
Definitely.
But this idea that there's too much stuff out there, and therefore, you know, that's going to result in lesser quality visual effects. I'm not sure that's the case. It definitely, you talk to a visual effects artist in the good times and the bad times, they're often doing a lot of overtime. They're often swamped with crazy demands. They're, you know, dealing with the fact that work's gone offshore, or that, you know, it has to be done on a sort of 24-hour time scale if you've got different people working in different time zones around the world. And those things will definitely impact on the work. Again, that's almost one of the reasons to possibly consider some sort of organization in the industry, a union in the industry, because you want those standards of work and those kinds of things that come with unionization to have an influence here. But I wouldn't pin some of the lesser quality effects, if that's what people are talking about, on the fact that there are too many shows and not enough artists. It's probably not something I'd say.
Now, is there a solution to the practical versus CGI? Is it on the studios, or is it on us as the consumers to kind of rethink the presence of CGI in films?
Yeah, well, a solution to it, I guess it's education, right? As I was saying up front, one of the challenges is that people refer to these things in a certain way, and it's often incorrect. So I'm on a mission to try and help educate people about what it means. Filmmakers, as I mentioned before, they do want to shoot everything for real. They do want things to be tactile and have that presence in a shot. But the reason we don't always go and film something practically, like a creature or even a miniature or a massive explosion, is it's too expensive sometimes. It doesn't look always that good. There are plenty of times when a practical creature looks like a man in a rubber suit. And visual effects will either replace that creature or go in and, you know, fix seams and do things. I mean, sometimes actually that's intended, because you could get great reference by shooting that person in a rubber suit on set, and you get lighting reference, you get the character interaction with the other actors. So it's not, one of the challenges is it's not one or the other. It's often a collaboration, and the best result is when practical effects and visual effects collaborate closely. And in fact, the truth is they do. One of the best collaborations really recently is Oppenheimer, where the visual effects supervisor, Andrew Jackson, and the special effects supervisor, Scott Fisher, just worked together for months before the film was even beginning to shoot on how do we do some of these, in the film there's these sort of macro level, atomic level things. Then there's also explosions, i.e. the nuclear Trinity test. So I think that collaboration was one of the finest in recent times. There's plenty of other examples of where the practical guys and the digital guys want each other to succeed. Maybe for a short time in the 90s, they used to fight. And they used to, because basically the argument, I suppose, was that digital was taking away the jobs of the practical teams. Nowadays, look, there's clearly less practical stuff done, less miniatures, but some of the makeup effects and animatronics houses have never been busier. And that's because filmmakers want something in their film that is tangible or even as reference. It's not always even kept in the final film or show. But in terms of solving the digital and practical thing, I think we need to educate audiences, but we also need to educate actors and filmmakers when they're put up on a press junket and they say, oh, no, we shot all this for real. And then it's not, because that information gets sent out, especially via social media, in crazy ways. And I think it's a matter of education.
Okay, excellent. Now, in terms of kind of marrying the ideas, virtual production is fairly new. In terms of video effects, how should we be discussing video effects in terms of virtual production?
Yeah. One little point is you say video effects, and I kind of, that's another thing that people often say, but you obviously mean visual effects, but people do say it as video effects. Totally cool. Virtual production is an interesting one. It means so many things, and that's a good thing, in the same way that visual effects actually covers lots of elements as well. Most people think about virtual production these days in terms of what they did on The Mandalorian, which is they went and shot in a big LED wall volume, and the actors could be basically on a soundstage against these LED panels that had real-time rendered imagery on them. And the real-time rendered imagery was of a good enough quality that you could set up a camera and you could shoot Mando, for example, against the LED wall and almost do an in-camera final visual effects shot, i.e. you didn't necessarily need to do any more post-production or visual effects work. It really helped on Mandalorian because he has a shiny helmet. And if he were doing that normally, putting him on some alien planet or whatnot, you'd need to usually shoot that on blue screen or green screen, which reflects in the helmet. So Mandalorian is a great use case for LED walls and virtual production. The other side of that imagery being real-time rendered is that you can move the camera and you can, in real time, move the imagery so the parallax between the characters and what's on the LED walls works. Now, one problem with virtual production and LED walls in particular is that, a bit like the CGI practical debate, everyone was assuming what they shot on an LED wall was what made it into the final show or film. It's probably 50-50. Okay. If you have imagery there for the actors to look at and lighting from the LED panels and from the imagery, it's awesome to help you integrate that character into a final visual effects shot, which is often the goal of shooting in an LED volume. It's not actually to do those final in-camera visual effects shots that I was just talking about. But there's almost been a misunderstanding of that in terms of, oh, that's why you do that LED volume work. And one of the problems with that is that I think sometimes it might get pitched to a production to do LED volume work, and then you kind of actually got to do the visual effects twice. Once to put the imagery on the back of the LED wall, and then again to do final visual effects shots when it's not quite what you needed. So that's one little controversy with virtual production. as I say, virtual production means so many things. It means pre-visualization, tech viz, post-viz. It can mean motion capture, virtual cinematography. All of these tools have been coming into the fore lately, partly from real-time rendering and game engines, and partly from helping you to using tools to visualize what will be the final visual effect shot. Because, that's one of the hardest things. Oh, I've got to put this person in an alien world. What's that going to look like? And you can use so many tools these days, especially with real-time renderers that let you do that quite quickly and have a lot of iterations. In how it relates to visual effects is it's definitely not a separate thing. Visual effects studios are absolutely part of the mix, discussing how maybe a virtual production solution will be used, especially LED wall filmmaking. And right now, there's actually a lot of specialist companies that are part of creating that imagery, turning it into real-time assets to put on the wall. And those are often previous companies or virtual art department, VAD studios. And then visual effects studios are actually part of that as well. So it's pretty awesome, actually. It's a whole new brand of work for visual effects artists and studios, and it's very exciting. Used extensively, on from the biggest films and Mandalorian to like indie art house types of projects that you wouldn't even realize had virtual production work.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've been since The Mandalorian came out, and they came out with the ILM kind of featurette of how they did it. I was so interested in it. It was very interesting.
Yeah, and ILM's solution called Stagecraft is fantastic, and that's also what's been happening a little bit. Visual effects studios have realized they're part of the process now. They're part of production. In the old days, visual effects is often treated as something just in post, and they wouldn't have even been involved enough, I guess, in early pre-production. Now they're, in Oppenheimer, basically Andrew Jackson, the visual effects supervisor, was one of the first persons who read the script from Chris Nolan. And I think that's part of the winds of change. And virtual production-wise, it also means visual effects studios are starting up their own virtual production outfits. Stagecraft from ILM, Pixamondo have a solution, Framestore has virtual production stuff going on. All of the studios have delved into this area in recent times. So it's great. There's just more work in that area, and it means that visual effects studios and artists are much more involved in the process.
Excellent. Yeah, I think that's very important. I think that in and of itself might be more to have to do with the quote unquote lesser quality output. Is if you don't have a visual effects artist on set making sure the shot is going to be what they need to make it look good, then you're just kind of putting yourself at a disadvantage, I feel like.
Yes, and that certainly happens on some productions where it comes in two ways. One is it's a big visual effects production, and just on the day, the overall supervisor or on-set supervisor just didn't happen to be there, and they don't get what they should have got in terms of the plate, the shot, or measurements, or scanning, or whatever. And then it comes into the fore in terms of smaller films or smaller shots or smaller productions where they like, oh, well, we'll just shoot this person against green screen and they'll sort it out later. But they don't have a professional telling them about lighting or how stage lighting is different than sunlight, natural sunlight. There's a multitude of reasons, as we've talked about, why shots don't work. It's usually lighting, especially if you're shooting actors, humans. And so, yes, it's really, really important to have professional, experienced visual effects people on set, part of the discussion early on, and not just throw everything to post. As I say, I think that's happening less and less, and those discussions are happening much further up front because, it's more of a mature industry, the digital visual effects industry. than ever before.
Now, we have one last question for you. This seems to be a hot button issue around the world, but what are your thoughts on AI or artificial intelligence possibly being integrated into visual effects?
It is the hot button issue, and I don't think it should be an issue at all. If that's not controversial enough, I'm sure someone will tell me if they watch this. What I mean by that is, in visual effects, we're constantly talking about experimenting with using new tools. Like, that's just how it is. Shiny new thing is what a lot of people talk about. They want to try the latest tools. It's a bit like the virtual production stuff. It's not one thing. AI isn't ever going to be one button or one thing that impacts filmmaking and visual effects. It's definitely, at the moment, a set of different tools that have made their way into off-the-shelf tools like Nuke or After Effects or Maya or other things. Then there's proprietary solutions that are coming out as well. There's the generative art stuff, Mid-Journey and even what's in Photoshop. So it's inside tools that we're using. The biggest challenge, I think, is that to use these AI tools, especially generative art ones, the training seems to have been done on copyrighted material or artist material without their permission. And, that's personally, as an ex-lawyer, I think that's crazy. And I can't believe there's not been more litigation about that issue. So I hate the idea that some artist has worked, their whole life and their work's been scraped. And then, you can pull up a image that is in their style, but they didn't do it. I mean, I think that's crazy and really has to be stopped. So visual effects artists absolutely mostly agree with that and don't want that to happen. The other side of it is there's a discussion about visual effects artists losing their jobs because of AI. It's definitely clear that you can do things in concept phase and ideation, and things like rotoscoping and match moving tracking seem to be aided by AI tools. But we've always developed tools that aid us in our processes and hopefully let us do it more quickly. So I'm not sure about that one. I don't want jobs to be taken away. I think it's going to be balanced by new jobs emerging in delivering training data, in using these tools and understanding them and helping filmmakers make things. There's already some really great examples of visual effects people using NERFs and Gaussian splats on set to do scanning work and, generate environments. I mean, that's helpful to a production. And more people who understand those tools, I think, is a good thing for visual effects. But really, my main issue is the copyright infringement and the artist's rights infringement with AI. And I would love that to sort of be dealt with by Hollywood in the same way that it dealt with, copyright infringement in music copying and downloading. I think it's very complicated and will really struggle. But the stuff with AI, automation is what visual effects artists love. You can see the benefits really already with things like de-aging, face dubbing, lip dubbing, and face replacement. It's already happening. The biggest one that's been around for a little while now is denoising in rendering. So some of the main rendering engines have a AI denoiser. And, the public doesn't really care or know about that stuff. But wow, what a great use of the technology and AI and machine learning to do that gets to a final image more quickly and with more fidelity. Hey, that's actually the mantra of every visual effects artist out there.
Excellent. Well, Ian, thank you so much. Those are all of the questions we have for you. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer them for us. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks, Brandon. Hope I didn't confuse anybody too much with visual effects, special effects, and CGI, but it's been a real pleasure chatting to you. Thanks so much.
If you're looking for more on visual effects, be sure to check out Ian's book and website linked below. And for more interviews or deep dives into the StudioBinder software, be sure to like and subscribe to be notified when new videos are added. I'm Brandon with StudioBinder Academy. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.